Have you ever wondered why science fiction in the 60s looked like this, but by the late 70s it looked like this? Or why in the 60s and 70s manga looked like this, but by the 80s it looked like this? Well, the answer to both those questions is actually the same, and it isn't Star Wars. It is one single artist, whose art influenced Star Wars and pretty much everything else. Like, literally everything I'm showing here has been influenced by him. I mean, freaking Federico Fellini said he was more important than Druillet. So what's going on here? How does one guy manage to transform the entire look of comics, animation, and film across 3 continents? And here's another question. Why is his work so hard to find today? Why has his entire legacy been reduced to a few of the same images reposted over and over online? While perhaps you've heard the name Moebius before, you likely only know a fraction of his work and his impact. So today, I want to do 3 things. Examine Moebius' life, his work, and this incredible impact. And if you just want to hear about influences and not biography, I'll put a timestamp for that below, but I think Moebius' work is a lot more interesting in the context of his life, so I hope you'll come on this journey with me. The year is 1984, and Moebius is missing. The once prolific artist, who had turned out page after page at remarkable speed, was putting out almost no new work. Yet, at the same time, Moebius' influence on pop culture was reaching its peak. Blade Runner and William Gibson's Neuromancer were popularizing the cyberpunk aesthetic he had created a decade earlier. He had done the designs for Disney's Tron. In Japan, 2 of his biggest fans, Hayao Miyazaki and Katsuhiro Otomo, were synthesizing his style into manga and revolutionizing the industry. So where was Moebius? He was in Tahiti. Why? Because he had joined a cult. A few years earlier, Moebius had come into contact with a group called Iso Zen under the leadership of a man known as Ios. Ios claimed that he was in communication with aliens, and Moebius was intrigued. So he had joined the group and become closer and closer with Ios personally. Soon, Moebius, his family, and 200 other members of Iso Zen followed Ios to Tahiti to begin building a new society. So, just as Moebius' work was going mainstream around the globe, the man himself was trapped in Tahiti, spending his days working on storyboards for a movie Ios had written to help spread his message. And so, we have to wonder, what type of man was Moebius? What was he searching for that would cause him to walk away at the peak of his fame to try and meet aliens? Well, to understand that, we need to understand that there's a man behind Moebius, a man named Jean Giraud. Let's go back, almost 30 years earlier, to 1957. The place is the home of Joseph Ghislain, a quiet, comfortable home built on a former orange grove at the edge of the Senate Forest, just outside Paris. Ghislain can afford this lifestyle because he is one of France's biggest comic superstars. He's known professionally as Gigé, and his hit Western comic, Jerry Spring, was bringing a previously unseen level of realism to French comics. On this fateful day, Gigé's doorbell rings, and he opens it to find 3 eager students waiting on his front steps. The trio were students at the Applied Arts Academy in Paris, and they'd become friends because they were the only 3 outcasts who wanted to draw comics. After trying and failing to find a teacher at school who would support them in this, they set out to find their own, and that's what brought them to Gigé's doorstep. Gigé was known for his friendliness, so he welcomed the 3 students in, and with his deep voice and lingering Belgian accent, gave them a tour of his studio. They all showed him their work, but he was most drawn to the work of one student, who was working in the same realistic Western style as Gigé. That student's name was Jean Giraud. After a pleasant visit, Gigé saw the 3 of them off. He couldn't know that one day Giraud would change the face of art around the world. In fact, he didn't even think of that visit again until nearly 3 years later when a letter arrived. He told Gigé how, shortly after that visit and disillusioned with art school, he'd left and joined the army. But the army quickly discovered Giraud's remarkable artistic abilities and assigned him to drawing. And now, back from his service, he sent Gigé the work he'd done in the military, and Gigé was impressed. He agreed to take Giraud into his studio as an apprentice. But the relationship soon became more personal, as Gigé learned about the young Jean Giraud's troubled upbringing. Giraud and his mother had been abandoned by Giraud's father when he was only 3 years old. This was uncommon in France in the 40s. He'd never met anyone else with divorced parents. This left him with a longing for a father figure that, along with his remarkable artistic abilities, would come to define his life.
I thought I was not beloved the way I deserved.
There were 3 things that helped Giraud get through his difficult childhood. The first was movies. One of his earliest memories is him and his mother watching a movie in a theater packed with German soldiers during the occupation. But after the war, it was the influx of American movies that captured his imagination. His second escape was into the worlds of science fiction. While science fiction was still a small niche subject, especially in France, the 40s and 50s were a time of great growth of science fiction writing, and young Giraud devoured all of the classics just as they were being released. His final, and probably most important escape, was into comics. Not only did he read French and Italian comics, but the legendary American newspaper strips were finally being translated into French, and Giraud fell in love with realistic and imaginative strips like Mandrake and Flash Gordon. To the amazement of his friends, Giraud would copy from his favorite comics and could imitate just about any style.
Once I did a drawing and everybody was very happy and look at that, it's beautiful, this child is a genius. And I had my way because I had the power to take the attention of the adults.
His studies at school weren't going great, so he followed his talents and went into art school. During art school, he even sold comics to a variety of French publications, mostly in the Western genre that he loved so much in the movies. But at 15 years old, Giraud had the experience that changed his life. His mother had married a Mexican man and gone to Mexico to live with him. On a break from school, Giraud went to visit them. Once there, he fell in love with Mexico and decided to stay. It was there he met new and interesting people. Painters, artists, spiritual visionaries. He was exposed to the deserts and vistas that would shape his work. And it was also here where he first encountered a certain plant that would have a profound impact on both his life and art. He hoped his mother's new husband could be a father figure to him, but he found him meek and unimpressive. Eventually, he gave up on his Mexican odyssey and returned to Paris and art school, but that mind-expanding trip would never leave him. And so, after school and after the military, he had come to Gigé not just as an artist, but as a boy looking for a father. And the kindly Gigé was happy to take him under his wing in both capacities. His apprenticeship was fruitful. Gigé introduced him to the work of the American artist Milt Caniff, whose realistic and dynamic storytelling had served as the backbone for Gigé's own groundbreaking work. He taught him the trade of comic making along with his little tricks, like subscribing to Arizona Highway magazine to have lots of photo references for Western backgrounds. After a year of tutelage, Gigé had the young Giraud ink an issue of Jerry Spring. Gigé might have wanted Giraud to continue on as his assistant, but the young artist had even bigger ambitions. From time to time, one of Gigé's friends, Jean-Michel Charlier, would stop by the studio. Young Giraud must have been impressed because here was another titan of French comics. Charlier was arguably the biggest comic writer in the country, having written many of the big stories for Spirou magazine, the popular comic magazine which also ran Gigé's Jerry Spring. But in 1959, Charlier and three of his fellow comic creators had defected from Spirou to start their own rival comic magazine called Phillipe. This is like the 1950s version of Image Comics. It was a huge hit. While Charlier's co-founders, René Goscinny and Albert Uderzo, made Pilot's breakout success Asterix, Charlier wrote the magazine's popular adventure serials like Redbeard. Naturally, Charlier wanted to add a Western series to Pilot's lineup. The genre might have been fading in the US, but Westerns were still incredibly popular in France. He tried to lure his friend Gigé away from Spirou, but Gigé wasn't ready to leave, so he suggested Charlier try out one of his young apprentices, Jean Giraud. Giraud agreed, and in 1964, Phillipe began serializing Charlier's story Fort Navajo with art by a young unknown artist who signed his work as Giraud. The strip was an immediate hit with French comic fans. Most of their attention focused on one of Fort Navajo's characters, a mysterious cowboy with the face of French actor Jean-Paul Belmondo. That cowboy's name was Blueberry. The strip would change both its focus and its title to Blueberry after the first volume, and, along with Asterix, became one of the driving forces of Pilot's success. Like most French and Belgian comics at the time, Blueberry was serialized a page or two in the magazine, and then collected into 46-page hardbound volumes. These first few volumes of Blueberry show Giraud working very much in Gigé's style. So much so that angry letters were sent to Pilote accusing him of plagiarism. The stories themselves are straightforward westerns, often remixes of popular Western films, but they're sturdy and well-constructed, and Giraud's art really brings them to life. Now, while it doesn't look anything like his later work as Moebius, the art on Blueberry is wonderful. It feels like Giraud just wants to show off in every panel. While Milt Caniff, who originated the style, relied heavily on fairly classic and generally close-up compositions, every panel of Blueberry is big, complex, and bold. You can see that he's internalized the mythic widescreen language of John Ford and translated that into the Caniff-Gigé cartoon style, filling each panel with as many horses, cowboys, and rocks as possible. It's very over the top artistically, at least by the standards of the mid-60s. I mean, here was what was going on in American comic books and Japanese manga at the same time. It's wild to watch the speed of his artistic growth as you read these. He's just trying out new things and developing this iconic style right before your eyes. Charlier's stories get tighter and more exciting, more action-packed. The French public was responding, and Giraud would quickly eclipse Gigé as the country's leading realistic comic artist. Like, I cannot emphasize enough that had Giraud only continued making Blueberry for the rest of his life, we would still be talking about him as one of the greatest comic artists of all time. But, as you know, things would soon change. Fall is here, and fall is my favorite season, but I have one big complaint with how it's designed. Where I live, it's still super warm right now, but it's also getting really rainy. I live in sneakers, and fall kind of bums me out when I feel like I have to lace up boots every day just in case it rains. Well, this fall's going to be different for me thanks to today's sponsor, Vessi. All of Vessi's shoes are waterproof, so I can throw a pair on in the morning and not worry about getting caught out in the rain. Plus, they practically slip on, so no more lacing up boots, I just throw them on and go out the door. And Vessi shoes are so easy and comfortable, now I find myself wearing them even on sunny days. My go-to is the Weekend, which is a terrible name because I wear it almost every day. It's something I can throw on, head into a coffee shop in a dewy morning, stop, maybe do a little yard work, head into the office, and even keep it on all night. It's easily the most versatile shoe in my wardrobe, so when I'm going on a trip and packing light, it's the one I take with me. So go get your new favorite everyday sneaker. Waterproof, breathable, and built for life on the go. Grab your pair now at vessi.com/matttt. With 15% off your first order, a 1-year warranty, and a 30-day return policy, you're gonna be all set. There's something ready to burst, not just in Giraud, but in all young people of his generation. Like the social unrest in the US in the 60s, the spirit of change was in the air in France, and it manifested in what is known as May 68. What began as a series of student demonstrations escalated into nationwide protests that brought the country to the brink of revolution. At least according to Wikipedia, I didn't read a book about this part. But what I did read a book about is how that mood of revolution came to the offices of Phillipe. Giraud and the other artists of his generation had been itching for change, for more control, for a reorganization around the new principles of the late 60s. Giraud and 30 of his fellow artists went to a cafe to meet with Phillipe's management, but the only manager that showed up was Goscinny. The artists all wanted different things: more creative control, more political content, or better working conditions, and they all tore into Goscinny. Giraud himself later admitted, "I laid into him in a horrendous way. Each attack wounded him deeply." Goscinny was never the same after this moment. Defeated and dejected after being turned on by the very artist he had spent his whole career trying to support, he ceded control of the magazine to this younger generation. With this newfound creative freedom, Giraud began pushing Blueberry further. He took more of a role in the writing, as Blueberry became even more of a countercultural figure in the mold of the revisionist Westerns. And his art moved even further away from Giget's classic style into something new, dynamic, and exciting. Volumes 11 and 12 of Blueberry, a two-part story about a lost gold mine, are arguably its artistic peak. Charlier's stories become a bit more character-focused, the adventure crackles, and just look at this art. Almost every page is absolute perfection. Dynamic, exciting, solid storytelling, just the peak of early 70s cartooning. Again, I encourage you to think about this in the context of other comics from this time. It's almost mind-boggling that this is from 1972 and not 1982 or even 1992. But despite the success of his rebellion, Giraud still wasn't satisfied. To many others, this might look like success, but he felt like a masked man, hiding part of himself away. Hiding his love for the science fiction, the avant-garde, surrealism, sexuality. There was so much he could not express as Jean Giraud. Years earlier, Giraud tried to convince Charlier to do a science fiction story for Phillipe, but Charlier wasn't even sure what science fiction was. But now, after more than a decade of drawing cowboys, he could suppress it no longer. On the side, to keep touch with science fiction, Giraud would occasionally do illustrations for science fiction books and magazines. To keep that work separate from his work on Blueberry Azure, he had used a pen name that he had used a decade earlier for a handful of strips in a Mad-style parody magazine. That name was Moebius. Right away, we can see a few important things in this illustration work. One is that this work is stylistically very different from anything he had attempted on Blueberry, that there is an entire artistic universe of different tools and techniques that he wanted to explore outside the confines of the Western genre. And two, that this was more than an art project. This was a side of Giraud that he needed an entirely new name and persona to make. Blueberry was still his focus, and his work as Moebius a side project, but that was all about to change. While published in Phillipe and signed by Giraud, if you want to find the real beginning of Moebius, this is it. This is where a new artist is born and begins to grow apart from Jean Giraud and will soon revolutionize the entire comic industry around him. Now, this wasn't revolutionary just because it was science fiction. Science fiction comics existed by that point. In 1967, Jean-Claude Mézières, one of the other 3 kids that had arrived on Giget's doorstep, had a hit with his series Valerian, which would go on to become one of the major artistic inspirations for Star Wars. No, here's the important thing. Moebius's work draws on another element, and I think it's this influence that makes his work so transcendent and timeless. And that influence is American underground comics. Or what I should have titled this video, How Robert Crumb Caused Naruto. I've never actually covered underground comics on this channel before, and this video isn't really the place to do that, so let's just quickly go over some essentials. The underground comics movement boomed in the US in the late 60s and early 70s as an alternative to mainstream comics, where cartoonists with wild, eccentric, and often X-rated sensibilities expressed themselves in publications that were largely distributed through record stores and head shops. But underground comics had gone through a pivotal transformation in 1972 with the publication of Binky Brown Meets the Holy Virgin Mary. Cartoonist Justin Green self-published this short comic that was both autobiographical and confessional. This was a big departure from the satire and humor that had dominated underground comics up to this point. This idea of autobiographical comics roared like a shockwave through the underground, and you can still feel its impact today. For one, it would inspire Art Spiegelman to create his own autobiographical work, Mouse. But it was underground comics' leading figure, Robert Crumb, who's most important to the story. Because after reading Binky Brown, Crumb switched from satirical animal stories to confessional autobiography. And on the other side of the Atlantic, a Robert Crumb fan named Jean Giraud took notice, and this became the final ingredient in creating Moebius. And so, in a special issue of Phillipe, Giraud published a 6-page story called The Detour. The main character? Jean Giraud, accompanied by his real-life wife and children. I think it's readily apparent, with its heavy use of text, its autobiographical elements, and its finely detailed art, that this was a work made under the influence of Crumb. But then, Moebius departs from the underground autobiographical comics movement by incorporating elements of his true love, science fiction. Into this deeply personal, confessional landscape, Moebius brings fantastic, unrealistic imagery. And this is the thing that's easy to miss about Moebius. This isn't science fiction as exterior, as a planet away, as escapism. Moebius uses the tropes of science fiction to travel inwards, to make visible with the language of science fiction the parts of his soul that words fall short of describing. His work as Moebius has an intimacy that is very unlike any science fiction that had come before. See, this is a man desperate to find some meaning in his own life. He had been looking for a father, but neither Gigé nor Charlier could fill those needs for him. And so he will, in his work as Moebius, use the language of comics and the visuals of science fiction to conduct self-exploration. And so it turns out that the detour was not a detour, but in fact the beginning of an entirely new path. Giraud's next major work in this direction was White Nightmare. This is much more clearly an underground comic, with less of his signature science fiction flourishes, but it's just as much a graphic experimentation, as he continues using a pen instead of a brush and exploring a mix of realism with more cartoon elements. But it is the horny goof where Moebius becomes fully formed. While I can't even summarize the plot on YouTube or show you most of the pages, what I can say is that it's here where Moebius first and most fully mixes the underground's anxiety and obsession with sex with flights of science fiction and fantasy. It also marks further visual experimentation, in page layouts, in approach to rendering and cartooning, even in the book design itself, as it tells two different stories on the left and right pages. Moebius may now fully exist as an artist, a merging of underground and science fiction, but he doesn't have anywhere to publish his work. The Horny Goof had been produced as a standalone book, but there was no magazine that could carry the short stories he wanted to create. And so, this need for Giraud to express himself as Moebius was about to bring on the biggest revolution in comics yet. With nowhere else to go, Moebius teamed up with 2 other pilote comic creators and a business guy who no one talks about to launch a new magazine, Metal Hurlant. The full story of Metal Hurlant would be a great subject for another video, but here's what you need to know for now. It was, on its face, a science fiction magazine, but it was also underground and transgressive. This wasn't science fiction in the vein of Heinlein or Asimov or even Meyers. This was something new and different, a manifestation of the new form of science fiction that Moebius was pioneering. And you could argue with this, but I think it's fair to say that Moebius was the star attraction of Metal Hurlant, at least in the early days. Well, of course, there are many other talented contributors to the magazine, like co-founder Druillet, Richard Corbin, and many others. Moebius was the artist most frequently featured on the cover, and the one who most often took up each issue's few color pages. Even many of the other major contributors, like Enki Bilal, would begin their careers in Metal Hurlant producing Moebius-style work, just as Giraud had begun his career imitating Gigé. And so, at an astonishing pace, in every issue of Metal Hurlant, the Moebius that we know today begins to take shape. So let's take a look at some of the key works from this period. Perhaps one of Moebius's most well-known stories, Arzac began in the very first issue of Metal Hurlant. Moebius continues his experimentation with creating volume by a mix of hatching and precise line work, all done with the pen, only this time he adds color, and the otherworldly palette gives it a whole new dimension. In a break with traditional comics, Arzac is totally wordless, as Moebius is confident and talented enough as a cartoonist to tell the story visually. It also introduces another key Moebius theme, which is a focus on the landscape. As much as this is a story of these characters, it's a story of this world, and like all great science fiction, it is a world that feels so much bigger than the tiny sliver we get. And before we get any further, this is probably as good a place as any for me to address some of the main complaints about Moebius, even among his fans. The first is that his stories are somewhat thin compared to his artwork. And I think that's fair. Through the lens of classic narrative, they're often fairly minimal. But at the same time, what we're given in these stories is the broadness of Moebius's imagination, and that is what makes them perfect for the medium of comics. Comics, unlike film or animation, invite us as readers to fill in the gaps between the panels, to participate in the act of creation. And so Moebius does the same thing with his stories, giving us the piece of something much bigger, but asking for our help to complete it. I mean, there are few images more remarkable in Moebius's work than the giant skeleton that serves as the background setting for the first issue of Arzac. It's just a background, but it's so well rendered, so solid in its construction, and so important compositionally that it demands that we use our imagination, that we have our own dream about what this creature looked like, how it perished, what kind of world could sustain such life. Moebius's stories aren't windows we look through, they're doorways that the reader has to open for themselves. And we should talk about the other major knock on Moebius's work, which is that there's often a lot of uncomfortable treatment of women. That's obvious in things like The Horny Goof, but even Arzac, two of the stories begin with the protagonist peeping on women undressing, and there's a lot of other and more egregious examples throughout his work. And if that's not something you want to read, totally fair. I'm not defending that kind of behavior. And if we view this as science fiction escapism, making the assumption that we're intended to empathize with these protagonists, I agree, that's pretty gross. But if we look at this through the lens of Moebius's work as an underground cartoonist, as an artist trying to express the ugly, embarrassing parts of himself in a safe way, I think we can have a different kind of conversation. Because in later years, Giraud would come to accept that he possessed a deep-seated fear and hatred of women. He would eventually work through those feelings in therapy, but I think what we're seeing here is Giraud exploring those fears and anxieties in a very public way. So in many ways, Arzac is the template for one strand of Moebius's work. The searching for self, the vast desert landscape filled with hints and clues of a larger world, themes of flying, and of course, big funny hats. But this was only the first of Moebius's work in the magazine, and many had a very different character. Giraud liked jazz, so let's use a jazz metaphor. Mainly because I'm worried that I already don't seem pretentious enough in this video. If Arzac is the tight, short, polished, roundabout midnighter birth of the cool, the Airtight Garage is the endless, improvisational, and experimental bitches brew. The origin of the Airtight Garage is important. See, Moebius often worked late at night, blasting out a page or two in a fit of inspiration and then dropping them off at the office in the morning. One day, Hurlant editor-in-chief Dionne found 2 such pages forgotten in a drawer of his desk, and asked Moebius for 2 or 3 more pages to finish the story. Moebius had forgotten the story, but sent off 2 more pages, but they didn't conclude the story. He did the same again next month, adding a few more pages without concluding the narrative. And again, and again. And so it went for the next 4 years. See, on the Airtight Garage, Moebius was intentionally improvisational, simply reviewing the last thing he wrote and then adding a little bit to it. The story would come to focus on the Major and his surreal and fantastic adventures. The art style and layouts would shift and morph. In this way, it's a playground for Moebius's wild imagination and talents as he rides the spectrum from realism to cartooniness, from sparse layouts to dense, from silly to violent. Again, it might not make much sense if you're looking for a straight-ahead science fiction adventure, but as a work of pure imagination piped straight into your veins, as a man exploring his own psyche up on stage without a net, it's incredible. Also, a lot of big funny hats. The Airtight Garage became a regular fixture of Metal Hurlant, but these were hardly his only contributions. I really want to emphasize this. Moebius was prolific. Many of his colleagues would remark on how fast and confidently he drew these stories. I've tried to catalog as much as I could for this video, but I just keep finding new images and stories I hadn't come across before. I really apologize for how much I'm leaving out. There's just so much to cover, and it feels like it's already going to be super long. Almost every issue of Metal Hurlant had new short stories or pages by Moebius. It's amazing how he can create whole new worlds, month in and month out, and pack them into 2 or 4 or 6 pages. We have to keep in mind that in comparison with a creator working on a corporate character in America or a long serial manga in Japan, Moebius would need to do character designs, set designs, and often vehicle designs for entirely new worlds every single time. This is an absolutely remarkable period of productivity, because let's not forget, while Moebius was doing this, Jean Giraud was still doing Blueberry. And Blueberry was still more popular than Metal Hurlant. That's what was paying the bills. After breaking with Phillipe, Tintin magazine picked up the serialization for volume 17, where Jean Giraud began allowing his work as Moebius to influence his work on Blueberry. This volume and the following one have some of my favorite art Giraud ever produced. It's so weird to me that this stuff has barely ever been released in the US. The best volumes of Blueberry are seriously on par or better than Giraud's work as Moebius. There, I said it. Please like and unsubscribe. I'm sorry for my terrible opinions. And as all this was going on, Moebius was gearing up for the next phase of his career, to pursue his final unrequited childhood love, the movies. Giraud's fatherless wanderings were about to come to an end, because a new and very different father figure was about to enter his life. One day in 1974, Giraud went to a movie studio to drop off a poster he had done for them, when he ran into a young director who happened to be there at the same time. The director's name was Alejandro Jodorowsky, and Giraud had no idea that Jodorowsky had been looking for him. Jodorowsky had made two major films at that point: the experimental Western El Topo and the experimental I don't know what to call it, The Holy Mountain. Both are really cool and operate in a similar register to Moebius, in which the internal and the symbolic are mixed with genre elements to create something entirely new. Also, a lot of big funny hats. Jodorowsky was similar to Giraud, but also different. While Giraud was mysterious, brooding, and often subject to inner conflicts, Jodorowsky was outgoing, charming, a master of tarot, and a deeply spiritual person. The French had loved Jodorowsky's first two films, and so the Chilean director had come from Mexico to Paris to begin work on his next movie. The producers said he could work on anything he wanted. His choice? An adaptation of Frank Herbert's Dune. Even though he said he'd never read the book, I guess he heard from friends it was really good. Now, unless you're watching this video 40 years before I've made it, you know we've had Dune movies. But you have to remember, this was still years even before Star Wars. Jodorowsky had gotten the rights to Dune for next to nothing because no one thought it would be possible to make a big science fiction epic. And so he began to build a team of misfits. And I'll use a few clips from the excellent documentary Jodorowsky's Dune, where he explains this a bit more.
I find a comic book. The comic book was Blueberry, cowboy book, drawing by Giraud. I start to see, but that guy is my camera. Who is this? In that time was not internet to find any person. I need to find this person. I went to see my agent, publicity agent, and there he was. By chance, he was there. And I say to him, you are the person, come with me.
Moebius was soon on a plane to Hollywood with Jodorowsky. On their return to France, the two would meet in a cafe every morning at 8 a.m. and work together until 6 at night.
Drawing by drawing, I shoot the picture. I need 3,000 drawings. Point of view, movement of the camera, dialogue, the relation between the actors. I use Moebius like a camera. I take Moebius, I say, now you advance. Now you travel, and now you make a close-up.
That's right. At the exact same time as Moebius was revolutionizing the world with his work in Metal Hurlant, the same time he was putting out new Blueberry volumes, he drew the entirety of the Dune movie. Jodorowsky had enchanted a number of other people to join them in Paris to work on Dune: legendary sci-fi artist Chris Foss, experimental Swiss artist H.R. Giger, and most importantly, special effects designer and science fiction writer Dan O'Bannon. O'Bannon had written, done the special effects for, and produced a movie called Dark Star with his college roommate, a guy you might have heard of named John Carpenter. But just as the Dune team came together, Jodorowsky was struggling to get financing to begin filming. This left two important people with some extra time on their hands. An amateur but talented illustrator, O'Bannon spent his weekends in Paris drawing a comic called The Long Tomorrow that transposed the classic hard-boiled film noir detective of the 1940s to a grim, futuristic city. At the same time, O'Bannon had become infatuated with Giraud's art and showed him The Long Tomorrow. Giraud fell in love with the story and asked if he could draw his version to publish in Metal Hurlant. Published in 2 issues of Metal Hurlant in 1975, these 16 pages are perhaps the most influential of Giraud's entire career. By grafting Moebius's fantastic flights of imagination and sense of realism to the setting of classic noir, they created something new and exciting. Moebius's world building turns away from vast deserts and surreal spaces to towering buildings, dirty streets, flying cars, and neon lights. They had created cyberpunk. Now, your eyes might not even be able to see how revolutionary this was because you've seen so many things influenced by it. For context, this is 2 years before Star Wars, 7 years before Blade Runner, 14 years before Akira, and 102 years before Cyberpunk 2077. But while O'Bannon and Giraud were revolutionizing science fiction on the side, things weren't going well for Dune. After 9 months of trying and failing to get financing, Jodorowsky and his producers gave up. Dune was dead, but its impact would not be. Again, I really recommend you watch the documentary Jodorowsky's Dune because it goes into this a lot further. But the filmmakers suggest that that massive Dune book, written by Jodorowsky and illustrated by Moebius, was passed around Hollywood and would become the unacknowledged inspiration for Hollywood science fiction productions in the decade to come. I can't verify that, but it is easy to see how this is another way in which Moebius's influence goes even beyond what we can document. But Jodorowsky, for his part, was depressed and frustrated. He had poured his heart and soul into Dune, had brought many of his new ideas to the story, and had nothing to show for it. At least, so it seemed.
No, I will not die. For me to fail is only to change the way. if we don't do that, the Dune we was doing is, the roots are Dune of Herbert, but this Dune is us, is the optical, is a creation. And then I will use everything I put in Dune to make comics.
And so Jodorowsky and Moebius began on the Inkle, an epic science fiction series that would be serialized in Metal Hurlant over the next 8 years. The Inkle might be Moebius's most well-known work, at least in the US, because it's thankfully in print. While it's not my personal favorite, in many ways it's the key Moebius text. Here he repurposes the previous elements of his work, the massive vertical cities of the long tomorrow, the themes of flight from Arzak, the twisting and improvisational narrative structure of the airtight garage, into one unified whole. But to understand the new elements of the Inkle, we need to understand the influence that Jodorowsky was having on Giraud personally.
He is one of the men who helped me to find more truth and peace in myself.
Giraud had a father who had brought him into comics, a father figure with whom he'd found success, he'd set off on his own as an artist, and now he had a father who would teach him the ways of mysticism. Jodorowsky was a student of numerous schools of esoteric traditions. While Giraud was no stranger to mind-altering substances, and his work had a psychedelic bent, it was Jodorowsky who immersed Giraud in the New Age movement. He introduced Giraud to The Teachings of Don Juan, a book that purports to document an encounter with the Yaqui Indian sorcerer and reveal his teachings. While later scholars would call into question the existence of any such sorcerer, some going so far as to call the author a conman, Giraud was deeply affected by the book. He dreamed of meeting a sorcerer of his own on his many trips to Mexico. This new spiritual bent would color his work greatly, as he moved away from just self-revealing sexual and satirical stories into a more mystical direction, a contemplation of the nature of the universe itself. And the Inkle is the peak of this approach. While Jodorowsky is the credited writer of the Inkle, it's very much a collaboration. Jodorowsky would dictate the story to Giraud, and he would draw it at frightening speed. But Jodorowsky has admitted that he was examining Giraud at the same time, drawing the story out of him as much as he was dictating it to him. The resulting product is fantastic and real weird. It starts seeming like it might be a straightforward science fiction mystery, and then maybe seems to morph into something more Star Wars style soap opera, before moving further into surreal and esoteric dimensions. Again, by contemporary storytelling rules, it's messy and strange. The characters often have no agency, they're not particularly deep or likable, and the story's moved along by coincidences and exposition dumps. But turn that part of your brain off, because this is fantastic. It is a work of pure imagination, of plugging Giraud's psyche in with Jodorowsky's mysticism and pouring it out onto the page completely unfiltered. Every few pages there is some new, incredible images, visions that still feel fresh and exciting even today. And since it's currently in print, I definitely recommend you pick this one up. It would take them 8 years to finish this book, and Jodorowsky would continue to expand the Inkle universe with other artists over the next 30 years. But Giraud's quest, his search for meaning, still wasn't over. Neither his success as Moebius nor his exploration of New Age traditions with Jodorowsky had filled that emptiness within him. In fact, just as Moebius had been a way for him to escape the confines of Jean Giraud, after a decade of Moebius, it had only become a new kind of prison for him. As you already know, to escape those confines, Moebius will end up in Tahiti and as part of a cult. But before we get to that, I want to do what I actually promised to do at the beginning of this video and track Moebius's immense influence across global pop culture. Of course, within Europe, Metal Hurlant was already a success. It inspired a wave of psychedelic, metaphorical, revealing, and symbolic science fiction storytelling, both within the pages of Metal Hurlant and beyond. But soon, the rest of the world would get their hands on Moebius. Now, there's a few different stories about what happens next. Some go that the Metal Hurlant founders had been looking for an American partner. Another goes that a humor writer had discovered Metal Hurlant on a trip to France in 1975. Whatever the case, Metal Hurlant ended up partnering with the National Lampoon, a humor magazine, to bring it to America. The National Lampoon titled this new magazine Heavy Metal, even though a literal translation is more like screaming metal, and added a number of new stories and features, but the bulk of the magazine reprinted stories from Metal Hurlant. Heavy Metal launched in 1977 and sent shockwaves through America. I think it's hard to fathom how big an impact it has, because unlike something like Spider-Man, it petered out and disappeared in the 80s. And Walt's been subject to a number of attempted revivals, I think it's easy to forget just how big a deal this was. Because now, between Metal Hurlant and Heavy Metal, Moebius's work was widely available in both North America and Europe. So first, let's track the massive influence that Moebius had on cinema, specifically science fiction cinema. How massive? Let's investigate. Perhaps the most important director in bringing Moebius's vision for science fiction to the screen is Ridley Scott.
I was steeped in heavy metal comics of those at the particular time, like Metal Hurlant and a lot of Moebius's stuff actually. And I was very impressed by that, and I was just in those days trying to wonder, how do I apply this to movies, how do I apply this kind of really fresh and beautifully visual thinking to film.
Not only does Scott's own drawings bear the stamp of Moebius's influence, he has even greater ties. See, after Jodorowsky's Dune fell apart, Dan O'Bannon was also left in deep depression, and in that depression wrote the script for a little movie called Alien. Ridley Scott would find that script and sign on to direct Alien in 1979. He would hire Dan O'Bannon to work on special effects, who convinced him to hire the other artists who had worked on Dune, Giger, Foss, and Moebius. So yeah, Moebius not only influenced Ridley Scott, but personally designed the spacesuits for Alien. A few years later, Scott would direct Blade Runner, which borrowed the bulk of its visual language directly from O'Bannon and Moebius's Long Tomorrow, and would become the key film in codifying the cyberpunk aesthetic. Even William Gibson, who is often credited with inventing the idea of cyberpunk in his novel Neuromancer, said, "It's entirely fair to say that the way Neuromancer the novel looks was influenced by some of the artwork I saw in heavy metal. I assume this must also have been true of John Carpenter's Escape from New York." Now, I can't find any quotes from John Carpenter about Moebius, but given that he was college roommates with O'Bannon, it's easy to imagine that, as Gibson says, he was influenced by Moebius's work while making science fiction classics like Escape from New York and The Thing. Now, the big unanswered question here is, when did George Lucas first encounter Moebius? Lucas has later admitted to being a fan of both Moebius and heavy metal, but not acknowledged it as an influence on Star Wars. Heavy metal didn't debut in the US until after New Hope was almost released, but Lucas was a comic geek and the part owner of one of New York's biggest comic shops. He had definitely read the French comic Valérian, which wouldn't be released in the US until 1981, so it's entirely possible that he had gotten French Moebius works as early as 1974 that helped shape the vision for Star Wars. I mean, there's so much of what Lucas created in Star Wars that reminds me of Moebius. The science fiction world that isn't polished chrome, but is beat up and lived in, yet still filled with massive, awe-inspiring imagery. We do know that soon after New Hope, Lucas was taking influence from Moebius, as the animation director of 1978's Boba Fett cartoon said Lucas explicitly directed him to make it look like Moebius. The other major science fiction filmmaker from this period who I've never seen talk about Moebius was James Cameron, even though I personally see that Moebius influence in films like The Terminator and Avatar. But in 1989, Cameron did hire Moebius to do concept art for his film The Abyss, so maybe he's been a fan all along. Oh, I also didn't mention Tron. Moebius did the designs for Tron, so that whole neon cyberspace thing can also trace its roots to Moebius. But his influence didn't stop in the 80s, and extended some of the landmark 90s science fiction films too. Luc Besson started reading Metal Hurlant at 14 years old, and when, 24 years later, he finally got the budget to make his own science fiction film, The Fifth Element, he not only drew directly on Moebius's work, he hired Moebius to work on the film. And hey, the biggest science fiction film of the 90s, The Matrix, does look an awful lot like Moebius, doesn't it? Well, that's no coincidence. When Lily Wachowski was asked if The Matrix was influenced by The Fifth Element, she said, "I think we were probably more interested in where The Fifth Element came from, which is Moebius. We were huge readers of Heavy Metal magazine." Now, the Wachowskis didn't hire Moebius for concept art, but they did hire comic artist Geoff Darrow. Darrow is one of Moebius's biggest fans in the industry and was also good friends with Moebius and worked with him in his studio at one point. Also, Darrow's comics rule, you should definitely check those out. But Moebius's influence doesn't even end in the 90s, it's still going strong today. Is there any more influential science fiction filmmaker right now than Denis Villeneuve? His sequel to Blade Runner ties him directly to the legacy of The Long Tomorrow, and when he finally made a Dune adaptation, it looks like a Moebius drawing come to life. I think he said it best himself. "I am a child of Metal Hurlant." Like, literally the entire science fiction film genre orbits around the star of Moebius's work. The films he worked on or directly influenced are themselves so influential that at this point it is impossible to conceive of what science fiction movies might have looked like without him. But of course, it wasn't just filmmakers. American comic book artists took notice of Moebius too. Jeff Smith cites heavy metal as a major influence on Bone. Mike Mignola, creator of Hellboy, said that when he saw Arzak, "I fell out of love with American comics, lost interest in the superhero subject matter entirely." Neil Gaiman says of reading Metal Hurlant as a kid, "I wanted to make comics like that when I grew up." Frank Miller's art style in his groundbreaking graphic novel Ronin bears a strong mark of Moebius's influences. In fact, Moebius later introduced Miller to his buddy Geoff Darrow, giving birth to their awesome collaboration Hard Boiled. Okay, so that's America and Europe and comics and movies. But Moebius's biggest and least acknowledged impact would actually happen on the other side of the globe. This is the March 1979 issue of Starlog magazine, a magazine that covered Western science fiction for the Japanese market. And this one issue completely altered the course of manga and anime. To understand the impact this magazine had, we need to understand the state of manga in the late 1970s. So time for some more really quick, oversimplified history. Manga in the 40s and 50s had been characterized by the cartoonish whimsy pioneered by Osamu Tezuka, with Disney-inspired squishy characters and often fantastic or science fiction-inspired stories. Manga literally translates to whimsical pictures. But in the late 1950s, a group of artists began rebelling against Tezuka's style. They favored realism, grounded stories that took place in a recognizable world, either contemporary or historical, from sports stories to more transgressive modern tales. This movement was called Gekiga, which translates to dramatic pictures. It was a huge hit, but by the late 1970s, this focus on realism was wearing a bit thin, and the manga industry as a whole was losing steam. In June of 1978, Star Wars was released in Japan and began awakening artists once again to the possibilities of breaking away from the confines of realism and returning to fantasy and science fiction. In anime, Space Battleship Yamato was already a hit, and soon after Star Wars, Gundam launched, but audiences wanted more science fiction, and it was to meet this demand that Starlog magazine was launched. But Starlog didn't just cover science fiction movies, they also ran comics, both manga and translated Western comics. And so it was that in March of 1979, they published the first Moebius story in Japan. The response was hugely positive, and Starlog would continue running Moebius stories, devoting an entire issue to him in 1981. But from this very first issue, it lit a spark. Naoki Urasawa, another on my list of probably the greatest mangaka of all time, remembers clipping Moebius's comics out of Starlog as a kid. Many other manga artists of his generation have similar stories. But it wasn't just kids. Even Osamu Tezuka, the god of manga himself who started the whole dang industry, began instructing his assistants to draw Moebius lines in their work. Hayao Miyazaki, then a struggling animation director, described the experience he and his fellow Japanese artists had when first seeing Moebius's work. We had discovered a new way of seeing. His son remembers him reading Arzak over and over, and it's clear he made his breakthrough work in both manga and anime, Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind, under the spell of Moebius. That's right, without Moebius, there is no Studio Ghibli. And I've already made a whole video about how a single page of Blueberry transformed Jiro Taniguchi's entire career. But no artist did more to amplify Moebius's influence in Japan than Katsuhiro Otomo. By this time in the late 70s, Otomo had already made a name for himself as a promising, talented artist working the late Gekiga style of minimal, realistic, dramatic stories. But when he discovered Moebius, he was changed forever. In October 1979, shortly after Moebius was introduced to Japan, Otomo released Flower. He's made no effort to hide his influence. His introduction to a later edition of Flower states, "This work was drawn under the influence of Moebius." Otomo would continue his move away from realism towards Moebius-inspired science fiction stories, with his short stories regularly being published in Starlog and other science fiction magazines. He would soon become known as Japan's Moebius, which shows you just how widely known Moebius was in Japan. But Otomo would soon eclipse Moebius, because he was far more than an imitator. He has said that he learned from Moebius how to blend science fiction with realism, how to take these fantastic concepts and treat them in a grounded way. In 1980, Otomo serialized Domu, a groundbreaking science fiction work that expanded on his Moebius-inspired approach, but it was his next work that really changed the world. Akira, begun in 1982, is the beginning of modern anime and manga. What makes Akira so special is this fusion of classic manga and Moebius-style comics, two things that really couldn't be more different. Where Moebius's work was dense and esoteric, manga was readable and engaging. Where Moebius often put equal emphasis on text and image, manga was all about visual storytelling. Where Moebius focused on world building and ideas, manga focused on characters. Where Moebius stories were short and compact, usually less than 8 pages, manga stories were long and epic, easily stretching to 1,000 pages or more. And by synthesizing these two opposite forms in Akira, Otomo created modern manga. As one notable Japanese critic has said, the history of manga can be divided into 2 periods, before Otomo and after Otomo. Akira was such a big immediate hit in Japan that it becomes impossible to disentangle Moebius's influence on the manga and anime industry from Otomo's. So when Masahashi Kishimoto, creator of Naruto, talks frequently about Otomo's influence, and Dragon Ball creator Akira Toriyama called Otomo his favorite artist, you begin to realize that if you trace everything back far enough, you usually find Moebius. It's also worth mentioning that Moebius was a huge fan of this stuff. He admitted his own later work was influenced by Otomo, and he loved Miyazaki so much that he even named his daughter Nausicaa. But despite appearances to the contrary, this is not in fact a manga video. So let's get back to Moebius, because believe it or not, he still has more significant works ahead of us. And so we come back to the early 80s, as Giraud's influence is at its peak, as his work in metal hurlant and in film over the past decade is changing the face of pop culture the world over. For many artists, that might be the dream of a lifetime. But Giraud was still unfulfilled. The quest that began with looking for a father, that led him to comics, that led him to Jodorowsky mysticism, that led him to explore his psyche in the pages of metal hurlant, had still not fulfilled him. He was a searcher, and so in 1978, some friends introduced him to Jean-Paul Apigueri, the spiritual leader known as Eos and the founder of the cult of Isozen. Giraud grew closer to the group and soon moved out of Paris to spend more time working with them. Druillet, an incredible artist and co-founder of Hurlant, had no kind words for this aspect of Giraud's exploration. He pissed us off with his New Age crap. With Jodorowsky, he went off on an esoteric trip. He moved to Tahiti to join a cult. They were waiting for aliens. They made me laugh with their nonsense. Their cult was more of an excuse for all kinds of excesses. As Giraud moved away from society and closer to Eos, soon Giraud convinced his wife, and in 1983, they moved their 2 children to Tahiti with Applegueri to build this new society. Giraud would later say he felt like the cult was trying to brainwash him out of his art. They forbid him to draw certain things that conflicted with their beliefs. Even he admits that some of his work from this period, like later volumes of The Inkle, suffered compared to his other work. Over the next year, more and more of Giraud's time became focused on doing storyboards for Eos's movie Internal Transfer, an animated film that they hoped to produce in Hollywood that would bring their views to the outside world. But Giraud's role on Internal Transfer had a benefit. He was traveling more and more frequently to LA to meet with the director and began having time outside of the group's control. Soon, he began to realize that Eos's motives weren't pure. He's been somewhat vague about the details of their falling out, but Geoff Darrow said it became clear that, like many such gurus, Eos's real goal wasn't world transformation, but just to sleep with all the women in the commune. Whatever the case, Giraud moved full-time to LA, and soon after, severed his ties completely to the Isozen community. Eos, for his part, had this to say about their falling out. The Crystal of Illumination was required to synchronize their languages, and for a while, under the tropical sun, they planned to have many children, for one was the son of the father, and the other the son of the mother. But Terra is mysterious, and her unfathomable designs do not always immediately unite with plans drawn up by he who is non-Earth, the Pater. And so, after some attempts at union in the present tense, the exit was approaching and a way had to be chosen, left or right. By the light of the Crystal of Illumination, each went on his way. Isozen actually bought an island, and they're still around today and have a pretty wild website. Anyway, upon coming to the US and breaking with Eos, Giraud was once again without a father figure, which is how he stumbled into his next guru. He came across a leaflet advertising Guy Claude Berger's book, The Raw Food War. Giraud had already been a vegetarian for many years, but now he decided not to eat cooked foods at all and soon fell directly under the ironically named Berger's spell. This new diet would once again change Giraud's outlook on life, and somehow, yet again, Giraud turns his personal search for enlightenment into a great comic book. And even stranger, this one began life as an advertisement. A few years earlier, Citroën had hired Giraud to make a promotional 4-page story for Citroën salespeople as a means of inspiring them, I guess. That's an insane idea, and I love it, and I hope someone at Ford is watching and think about hiring Anders Nielsen to do their next training manual. But as Giraud drew this motivational comic for car salespeople, he got excited. The story expanded from 4 pages to 6 to 10 to eventually 40 pages. It began with 2 space mechanics, Stel and Atan, but soon they would find themselves on a journey to set off to find a new world, a paradise called Adina. It rules and was hard to find for a while. Oh, to be an 80s Citroën salesperson. But a few years later, as he was focused on healing his soul with raw food, he came back to this idea of paradise. On a visit to Tokyo, over the course of just a few days, he drew an entire second volume of Stel and Atan's journey, now known as Adina. In it, he explores his relationship with food, corruption, and paradise as Stel and Atan discover the reality of the world of Adina. Artistically, it marks another major evolution for Giraud. After having explored realism in Blueberry and hyper-detail as Moebius, he now heads in the opposite direction. Inspired by the classic Belgian comics of his childhood by the likes of Hergé and Jacobs, Moebius begins working in what is called the ligne claire, or clear line style. He strips everything down to its fundamentals. Gone are the hatching, stippling, and heavy brushstrokes. Instead, he defines everything with very controlled, precise lines. This is yet another work that could be argued as Moebius' artistic peak. I've heard him quoted as saying he spent 40 years learning how to draw just so he could forget it all. This level of simplicity is deceptively difficult to produce. Of course, he wasn't just doing Adina, he was still doing new volumes of Blueberry and a bunch of other work that I'm skipping over. He even managed to find time to do a Silver Surfer graphic novel with Stan Lee. It's only a handful of pages, but it's awesome seeing the scope of Moebius applied to Galactus and the Marvel Universe. This and his handful of superhero illustrations really make me wonder what it could have looked like if he had pursued superhero comics more seriously. Unfortunately for Giraud, it turned out that Berger the raw vegan was another false guru. Not only was he a phony, he moved to Switzerland to expand his practice of metasexuality, where he committed crimes I'm not even going to mention on this channel and was eventually sent to jail. Giraud had produced more amazing work that once again reflected where he was in his personal journey, but he was still looking for answers. It's a reminder that no amount of success, talent, or prestige can solve everything. In the late 80s, Giraud met the person who would be his final father figure, Isabelle Champeval. Giraud had already been drifting from his wife Caroline at this point and began a relationship with Isabelle in 1987 after meeting her at a book signing. Giraud later said that his life can be divided into before Isabelle and after. The two married a few years later, and it seemed that Giraud's search was finally over. Isabelle took over the publishing responsibilities for his work, as well as managing Giraud's massive legacy. Now, I will say that online, you see a lot of accusations that the reason so much of Giraud's work is out of print is because of Isabelle. I've never seen her respond to that, so I'm just going to leave it there. But of course, Giraud wasn't done working. After Charlier's death, he produced 5 more volumes of Blueberry on his own. He did the art for volume of 13, and a bunch of other stuff I'm skipping over, but his final major work would be Inside Moebius. Inside Moebius, done in the increasingly minimal style he'd been working towards since Edina, is something new. Originally begun as a diary to help him get through the 40 days he'd committed to stop smoking weed, he'd continued the diary over the next decade, growing it to over 700 pages. It's once again a work of improvisation, as Giraud attacked the page with no script, no pencils, just pen right to paper and let it flow. The main character is Giraud himself, and he's visited by these central fictional characters in his life. Arzac, the Major, Blueberry. He examines these fictional characters, and they examine him. In a way, it's the perfect summation of Moebius's work, as the walls between fiction and autobiography break down, as the literal and the imaginative coexist, as a man with two identities attempts one last time to reconcile who he is. Because, after all, Moebius is named for the Moebius strip, an object that appears to have two sides, but has only one. In the end, there was no Moebius, just a man named Jean Giraud, who showed us that the answers to life's biggest questions might not be outside our door, but inside our own imagination. Jean Giraud died in 2012, and I can't say if he found what he was searching for, but I do know that his search carved a path into the woods of creativity that artists and readers will still be following for generations to come. Thank you guys so much for watching. If this video is too short for you, I'll have links below to a lot of other resources, but I do really suggest you check out Jodorowsky's Dune and Dr. Moebius and Mr. Gur, which is a long-form compilation of interviews with Moebius over 30 years. Again, there are links to purchase what's in print down below, and we can hope together that more stuff will come in print soon. Thank you guys again, and I'll see you soon.